Hello, everybody. This is Selena, aka Bella Beluga, on a pretty nice Sunday here. And I am joined today by Kelly, aka Moonknitter. Hi, Kelly. Hi.
It's also a pretty nice Sunday here,
There we
but it's a
go.
little chilly.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's like cloudy, but it's supposed to get extremely hot, so I feel like the Mars Jupiter conjunction kind of is gearing up for 90-degree weather in Chicago.
Oh no, all that far
Yeah.
north? I was gonna say, because, like, I'm born and raised and still live in Florida. Like, 90 degrees is just kind of like, this is about like mid morning temperature most of the year.
Uh-huh.
But I know that we're more equipped to deal with it. So I hope that you can stay cool up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, welcome. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about crafting and astrology today. I have really wanted to have you on. Like, I think you were probably one of the first people I met on Twitter that also does like astrofiber art stuff. And I was just like, holy shit, like there's somebody else out here, like that's doing this. And then like I've found more and more people, and I'm just like, this is amazing. But it's really integral to your practice. Like it's throughout so much of your branding. It's in your name. It's in a lot of the graphics and stuff. Like you offer astro knit garments. So go ahead and introduce yourself. And for people who don't know you, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so I'm Kelly. I am a knitter and an astrologer, but I'm also an art teacher. And I feel like all of those things were not always interconnected in my life because I learned each of them at different times. But
Mm.
I feel like there came a point where they all became very interconnected. So I guess I learned how to knit first when I was like 10 from a book. And my mom always crocheted, but she had tried to teach me. And there's something about teaching knitting and crocheting with the hand positions that can be very
Mm.
difficult. Like everyone kind of has their own way of holding their needles
Oh
in
yeah.
crafting. And I feel like the way that my mom did not like end up being the way that I did when I finally learned crochet. So it was very hard to learn from her at first.
Mm.
Um, and then later I took a crocheting class like in college, and that was around the time that I was also learning astrology. Like I think probably when I learned crochet was like the same around the same year that I first saw my birth chart.
Oh wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah, and I think like they weren't really connected for me when I first learned each of them because when you're like a beginner at anything, it's sometimes hard to like make stronger connections to other
Mm-hmm.
things that one thing that you're a beginner at is connected to. But as I like gained more knowledge in like practicing crocheting and like learning astrology, I started to see connections between them. And I don't think that I realized at the time that I was connecting those things. But looking back, like I made a giant like granny square artwork
Mm-hmm.
for my BFA, like for art school, and and I think that I had like some kind of like romantic idea about how Granny Square is like because you kind of start like in the center and you're
Mm-hmm.
repeating a pattern that expands outward, and it
Right.
has different kind of like levels to it, and the pattern is repetitive, and it felt like that had a lot to do with life.
Mm.
So, and I think that that's kind of now I've learned like how I feel like the connections intermingle with
Mm-hmm.
like things that are cycles and patterns in our lives. Like as I've learned astrology more, that's something that's very important to me about learning astrology is like recognizing the patterns that I have in my life that either are like not good patterns that I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
fix or positive patterns that I want to continue.
Right.
So I think in the end, and like at this point now in my life, that's how I connect those things. And so, because I started to see that connection, I wanted to create. Well, I always did. I mean, not always, but I did commissions for a while of knit and
Mm-hmm.
crochet things, so it was something that was normal for me. But then I got very into gridding, like creating
Mm.
my own grids of like knit symbology.
Yeah.
And that's how I started to combine the gridding and kind of like creating my own patterns for knitting and things like that with my astrological knowledge. So I've been starting to create like custom knit garments that are based on people's birth charts or depending on the person, it might be like based on their solar return chart.
Mm.
And we kind of like co create a birth chart for the garment. And then I have a whole process of gridding out the different symbols and where they'll go on the garment.
Mm-hmm.
And then like sharing that with the person that it's for and receiving feedback. So it's very um, like interrelated, and it's not just
Yeah.
me creating something that I like put up and sell for someone. It feels like we're making something together because it's something that I'm hoping is important and that the person will want to wear because it's connected to like their being basically.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about like elections, right? Is like you can have one that's great on paper, but maybe not like, well rooted for your natal chart, you know? And so that's what
Yeah.
you're doing is, you're rooting these garments in somebody's chart.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something that I've learned through this also is like there might be an election that's not technically good on paper, but it fits very well with the person.
Right.
Like the one that I'm working on now while we're talking is
Mm-hmm.
for someone who like their solar return chart had the Mars Venus conjunction and Mars was exalted, but they're like
Mm.
a night chart natally, and like Mars is kind of a energy that they had been working with a lot in kind
Mm.
of like their life. So it was something that I felt like it was kind of necessary to highlight because it was
Mm-hmm.
like Mars in their birth chart wasn't doing so well, but Mars in their solar return, it's like you're having this whole Mars experience and Mars is being supported and like
Yeah.
lifted up in
Right.
like in this time in your life. So it
Hugely.
feels like
Yeah.
that's something that needs to be emphasized. Yeah.
Cause like I mean what a great like I mean cause I mean that you do have to look out for that like I really like Mars and Capricorn like I really the tenacity is always the first thing that I think of like it's a very tenacious placement.
Mhm.
But like exaltation, it's like sometimes it can be a little too much. With malefics, they can get a little too comfortable and kind of like, oh well, nobody's gonna stop me. But like Venus being there, kind of that pacifying sort of effect, like being given this power to make these structural changes. How can you use
Mhm.
them for the greater good? Versus what's the
Yes.
most powerful way you can exert yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also the thing that I have realized a lot about malefics in talking with people about these garments, but also like in general doing chart readings for people
Mm-hmm.
is like obviously, I mean, I think that for me, I feel like learning about sect really changed my like
Yes.
life in terms of learning about astrology because there are certain planets that do better in the day than they do in the night. And I feel like malefics are like a major kind of representation of that because you have one planet that is not really suited to be in like in that time in that like you know night or day like
Mm.
like Saturn is not really suited to be during the night and like Mars is
Yeah.
more suited to be during the night, so
Yeah.
it kind of gives a temperance to it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, like there's so much nuance around like malefic planets, I think. And it's something that I think a lot of people and understandably so, I mean, especially when you're talking about like talismanic stuff, maybe like not fucking around too much with, don't immediately come out of the gate like trying to bottle Mars or bottle Saturn or whatever. But with something like what you're doing where you're creating something with somebody to help them manage that relationship that they already have, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
there's more possibility there. It's safer. like it's a much more, I think, buffered kind of manageable way to, to genuinely work with them, but in a
Hmm.
good context, tailored for you.
Yeah, and I think that's what excites me a lot about it is being able to tailor it to the person that it's being made for because
Mm,
like one person might be comfortable with Mars in their birth chart and might want to emphasize that with something that they're wearing on their body, but
right.
other people might not want Mars on their body. Like and
Yeah.
that's understandable because we have different like our planets are in different conditions in our charts and they make different aspects with other planets that kind of change our relationship to them.
Mm,
Like someone else that I was making a garment for has the nodes on like the ascendant and descendant axis,
okay.
like pretty conjoined with their ascendant and descendant. And I was like, should we do like an eclipse chart for the election or is that too crazy? And they were like, I do not want to have like an eclipse on my body. And I was like, okay, that's totally valid. Like,
Yep.
because I feel like if it's something I like the reason why I asked because I might not ask with other people, but
Mm-hmm.
because it's already such an like integral part of the way that you're showing up in the world, it
Yeah.
seems based on the chart. But sometimes it's also one of those things where the the placement might not be something that you're comfortable with at this stage in your life and you become more comfortable with it as you're older.
For
And
sure.
so like maybe in the future someone might want like an eclipse elected, garment to wear, but like it's definitely that there are many energies that can take a while to understand. I think that's also why I feel like um, the knitting or crocheting and astrology fit well because it's like sometimes there are just things that take a long time for you to figure out, like
Oh yeah.
technique wise or pattern wise or like taking out things and redoing it, like we were talking about. Um,
Yeah.
it's just kind of like it's a process, and that's
Yeah.
how like it is understanding our charts too. It's a process.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, it's I think it's one of the earliest pieces of advice that I ever got, I guess, about astrology is that like, you know, don't worry about everything kind of showing up at the same time. Like not all of this is going to mean what it means right now in your life or has already occurred. Like this covers your whole life. Like especially
Yep.
when people start talking about like the triplicity lords, like which is still something I would like to learn more about, but like how that like helps you further understand how those planets work throughout different segments of your life, and how
Hmm.
their roles change. And so it's really important, I think, to look at this kind of context, um, you know
Hmm.
so I
Yeah,
mean.
I think that that's also a big part of why I connect so much to like perfection years
Oh
because I feel
yeah.
like it's a similar um like way to understand what's emphasized at that time in your life, what part of
Mm-hmm.
your chart is emphasized and like what you need to be working with during that time.
Yeah.
And it's again like a cyclical thing. So you're going through each house of the chart in cycles and in the same like order really each time. So it's kind of like activating the same aspects and the same planets in the order
Mm-hmm.
of your birth chart and your houses in your birth chart. So it's very unique to you, but it's also cyclical and repetitive. And I think that that's something that is exciting for me to kind of pay attention to, especially like in connecting the knitting and astrology.
Right. So yeah, I did talk on here after I got that amazing what are you calling unraveling the spiral,
Yeah.
reading the childhood profections one. Like so if you'd like to talk more about that and like how you use profections, and if you want to talk specifically about like childhood profection years, it was really really super helpful for me, and I think it's a really great framing, that I'm hoping that
Hmm.
more people will adopt or approach or at least consider.
Yeah. I think, well, yeah, I guess to speak a little bit about it, like I said, I'm also an art teacher, and
Mm-hmm.
so like that is also very connected in how I am viewing the world in general. So learning about astrology, I feel like you kind of get the message that like the IC is where to look for childhood, and that's
Mm-hmm.
like kind of it.
That's it.
Um, yeah, so if you want to know about your childhood, just like look at the IC, and that's all that they kind of tell you. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think a lot of times we think about perfection years, but we don't really think about the perfection years of our childhood as much because it seems like I don't really remember that, or I don't really know how that fits into what's going on now.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I also felt like a lot of when you look at the house topics for like if you look at just anyone who does like a um house topic graphic, like I know like Kelly Surtees and Chris Brennan, like those are the ones that I'll like look at, if you like Google it or something.
Yeah,
And
right.
they don't really have like childhood related topics necessarily put into the house topics. So
Yeah, or
it's
unless it's
also
about like
sometimes,
becoming a parent, like having
yeah,
children, but like not childhood,
yes,
like the experience of it.
yes, exactly. And I think like that's also something that's exciting for me too is that these like perfection year readings can also be helpful, or like even just translating the house topics to childhood can be helpful for
Mm-hmm.
people who are parents, or like for me as a teacher too, because
Oh yeah.
it's like writing that out and thinking about it, I was like, okay, like all of my 5th and 6th grade students are like going through this same like kind of issue in their perfection years, like like 11th 12th house years, where they're trying to understand themselves like socially, but then also dealing with kind of like growing up and feeling like kind of a death of childhood going through the
Yeah.
12th house. And so it helps me understand like and contextualize like those years in a way that is helpful to me as an astrologer and a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I also feel like I hope that it's helpful for people who are trying to understand and learn about their childhood more, because like if you are kind of like, oh, there's something that happened to me like in my 8th house year, but I'm going to look up the topics for them, and it says it has to do with debt and taxes and like other people's money, and that just does not relate to anything that like you might be going through necessarily when you're in an 8th house perfection year as a child. So
Right. Because you're
just
how
trying to
old
like
then?
re-envision.
Like, what would eighth house be?
You're 9.
Right. Yeah, what is a 9-year-old gonna have to know about, like, any of that ever?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are ways that I feel like it can be connected, but those are kind of like the exercises that I've been trying to do of like, okay, well, if it has to do with like other people's money, maybe
Sure.
there was some sort of inheritance issue that you went through at that age, or but
Right. Or,
then
like, your
also
parents lost your
another,
job and, like, the, like,
yeah.
family income went down. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. But I think it just kind of takes like a little bit more of like understanding the possibilities and then translating it for yourself, and I just feel like it's an important reminder that those times of your life are still important to look at and can be expanded upon more than just thinking about the IC,
Mm.
or the 4th house. So yeah.
Yeah, I pulled up I shared this with my chat just now, the this great house topics and childhood graphic that you made. Um
Yeah.
yeah, cuz like I'm looking at that, so like eighth house you have is like sharing secrets and learning about death. Um
Mhm.
which yeah, I mean those are definitely things that, like you think about, going through as a kid. I think one of the biggest things that I like had as like a takeaway from our reading was just thinking about how like the houses, especially the houses that square each other, like how it sets off all of those other year topics as well. Because
Mhm.
these years, like, perfection years, I mean, the house topics are concentrated a lot on that, but, it is inevitably also going to bring in, well, how does my eighth house interact with my, like, second and fifth and 11th,
Yeah. And
Yeah.
especially like I was saying, that's what's so exciting about perfection years in general, is that they are kind of like activating planets in a certain order,
Mm-hmm.
and by extension those planets and their aspects with other planets and their relationships with other planets
Right.
and their conditions, like how they're doing in your life in general. And so, and especially with squared signs, a lot of the time the same planets can rule like
Mm.
squared signs. So like
Right.
that's definitely especially with like the mutable. So like
Yeah.
Sag and Pisces ruled by Jupiter, and Virgo and Gemini ruled by Mercury. So like
Mm-hmm.
anytime you're going through those squared houses, it brings up like the Mercury and Gemini relationship, or
Mm.
Mercury and Jupiter relationship. So it's just interesting to notice how the relationships between planets can be activated repeatedly throughout your cycling through your houses. And then the other thing that has been exciting about the childhood readings too is that I'm basically starting with like kindergarten, and that's the sixth house, and we
Mm-hmm.
go through the whole top of the chart, which is very interesting because it's like the first time that you're going through the top half of the chart, and the top half of the chart
Mm.
has a lot to do with like your external self. So it's like the first time that you're beginning an external self, because it's the first time that you're traveling through those houses and their um, planetary rulers.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's gosh, like that's one of those things that like I feel like feels like such a basic concept, but just like the whole looking at the hemispheres of the chart, for how these house topics and for how these transits affect us. 'Cause
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's like you spend so much of childhood just like being kind of still, still really growing and developing, so much, and then yeah, starting to come out of I don't know. I mean, like when I think about, people look at like kangaroos, right? Like giving birth and it's like this tiny, barely functional, like, not even half cooked, like little, kangaroo like that, climbs up, embryo basically that climbs up and then resettles itself and then grows from there. And like, it's kind of analogous to like humans as well, cuz like it takes us so long to like be anything close to like kind of capable of going out and doing our own stuff. Like, but I feel like it's also a cultural thing, about like how much responsibility do we give children and when,
Yeah.
because the U.S. like
Yeah.
it really seems to depend. Like, what are your kind of experiences with like about how children handle responsibility? I guess.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that I was also thinking about in terms of the perfection years and like the
Mm-hmm.
whole like just generally astrologers like not putting house topics that are specifically like about childhood into their house topic,
Mm.
explanations,
Yeah.
because in a way like we really segregate children from the rest of the world. Like they go
Mm.
to school, they go to daycare, they go to after school programs, over the summer they go to camp. Like we kind of like push them out of our lives in many ways,
Yeah.
because, and like adults, like I know many people who are not teachers and like never see kids because the kids are not like, necessarily, I mean sometimes you'll like see them on the train on the weekend or something. Like they're just not really like out and about because they're being brought to their own places. Like their parents
Yeah.
go to work and they go to school. And so um so in a way, like I I think that in a way that contributes like negatively to the whole like children kind of being implicated within like community and understanding what community means. Like in one way, they understand it very fully because they have a very tight knit community in their classrooms and with the other students that they see every day,
Mm-hmm.
but they might not understand as much like what their parents' communities are because,
Mm.
someone's like going to work or going places without them. There's places that kids are just like not allowed to go. So Yeah, but I feel like that is also a big part of what school is often trying to teach is independence. At least like I feel like that's constantly what I'm trying to do um like in teaching art because
Mm,
I have like students have a lot of choice in my classroom and they basically learn about all the different materials of art and then they're supposed to be able to get them out themselves and put them back themselves even like in first grade, and
mm-hmm.
that's what I'm expecting of them. And I definitely often do like give mini lectures of like, I'm trying to teach you independence. You know, like you are in first grade, but I want you to be able to put everything away by yourself. If I wasn't here and there was a sub, you should be able to like do that on your own.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like there's many ways that we try to teach kids independence, but there are also ways where the fact that we're segregating them in many ways by like having places where kids aren't allowed or aren't expected to go, or like times of the day where they're not expected to be anywhere but school,
Mm,
um, kind of makes them less able to develop that independence in some ways. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, when would you say, I guess, like astrologically, like when do you find a correlation in kind of like what profection years kids tend to start realizing that independence? I mean, is it like seventh house year stuff, like realizing there are other people outside of me and like, there is a separation between me and others?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean that's definitely a good like place to think of because the seventh house is your when you're 18.
Mm-hmm.
That's your like second time that you're going through the seventh house perfection year. The first
True.
time is when you're six.
Mm-hmm.
So and I think I also said earlier about the eighth house that that's nine, but it's seven.
Mm.
So um so yeah, but anyways, I would say 18 definitely like is a major like independence turning point for sure, and that's a seventh house perfection year. But also the first house perfection year is when you're um 13, no, 12. So when you're 12, like that's when you are either like obviously more obviously like going through puberty to the
Mm-hmm.
outside world, um and you're expected to be more independent at that time also. Like I know in my school that's definitely at that point the kids are in middle school and they are like switching classes. The little kids don't switch classes between teachers. um they're expected to do a lot more than the kids in fourth grade are. Once you
Right.
get to like fifth and sixth grade, they have a lot more expectations put on them. Um, and so I think that that is also like another major turning point for the independence is a first house perfection year. Definitely like the angular houses in general um, are kind of big like turning points for independence and like self actualization, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think 18 is probably like the safest bet with the seventh house year. But um, I think there are other areas where there's like an independence that is kind of like being brought upon students, even if they're not like there yet.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
think also when we did your childhood perfection reading, did we
Mm-hmm.
talk about like when you first started crafting? Wasn't that your like a Mercury ruled year?
It probably would have been, yeah, because that would have been either,
Was it your ninth house year?
probably was, because I would have been, what, 8?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's probably about right for like the first time that I ever really started. Like, even before, so my mom, I think, taught me crochet proper when I was maybe a little bit older than that, but like by 8, I was already like I was always the kid who wanted like little craft kits for like presents and stuff. Like I wanted to learn how to make like the beaded keychains and like sand art and like, clay
Yes.
stuff and whatever. Like I just always wanted to be making little things. So
Hmm.
I think that 8 was probably one of those times when I really realized like I think I might have at least by that point had like a little like knitting spool, to just sit there and make tons of I-cord. Um
Yeah.
which I was so like I was just like flabbergasted like a couple of months ago because I wanted to get one of those and I could not find anywhere in person that would sell me a knitting spool.
Oh my
Like
God.
this is such a basic tool. Like I think it's so good for helping people understand the anatomy of a knit stitch. Like literally
Yeah.
making them like that and like but I could not find a single one. Like I ended up with this really nice like hand crank like cord machine, but it's not
Uh,
the same.
so are you talking about the ones that are kind of like nowadays? I feel like they are really pushing these ones that are like this a circle and they have
Mhm.
larger what's the word? Like pegs, I guess, on them. And then you
Mhm.
would pull one over the other like a loop.
Yeah.
And the ones
Right.
nowadays like make a hat, but I
Yeah,
had
it's
like
more like
one that was
loom
like this
knitting.
big that made like I cords. Is that what you're talking
Right.
about?
Yeah, that's exactly what
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
talking about. Just like a regular knitting spool. Yeah, because now it's all like, like loom knitting is great. And like, I think
Yeah.
it does make it accessible to more people. But like just a regular knitting spool, I'm like, this, what? Like, I was just kind of, yeah, just really shocked. Let me see. Over on my side, Zombie Paper in my chat says, "Hey Bella and Kelly. I feel like this is part of why kids rebel because they're treated insignificantly rather than with respect and autonomy." And I definitely agree. Like it's so
Hmm.
frustrating as a kid feeling like nobody listens to you, and like nothing about you is respected.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
So.
also like from as a teacher point of view, like there are also just a lot of like sometimes things like that will happen where I can tell that a student like can feel that way, but
Mm-hmm.
there's 30 other kids in the class who are asking for like something that I need to do for them,
Yeah.
and I only see them for an hour, and so that's just kind of like also a issue with our like education system is that like it's just there's a sense of like rushing or
Mm.
like urgency that can make it feel like you can't develop those relationships as well.
Yeah.
That I have like definitely enjoyed that about teaching in after school programs because the sense of urgency isn't there as much that like you need to put in grades and like your grades are due by this certain time and
Mm-hmm.
there's a curriculum that you have to get through and then you're kind of like projecting that onto the students sometimes. So I feel like that's why extracurricular activities are always a good thing for kids because they kind of have more agency
Yeah.
and less pressure. And the adult has less pressure also.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I also agree about like the different kits and stuff that you could get as a kid. Like that's how I learned knitting, and I feel like having the independence to do that on my own was also very helpful.
Mm.
Um, and like yeah, having agency to feel like, okay, I did this on my own just from like reading this book and looking at the pictures of like how to do those things. I think that was also during a Mercury ruled year for me because that was when I was 10 and that's my 11th house, which has my
Ah.
Mercury ruled Mars. So,
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Oh, that's right. Don't you have Mars in Virgo?
yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is gosh, who was it? I think Catherine Urban said something earlier today about Mars and Virgo. That was funny. Something about being like kind of like chaotically organized.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think I saw it. Yeah, that's definitely how I feel a lot of the time. Yeah, and I feel like that also is very tied into my like teacher life too. Like
Hmm.
my classroom is always like a complete mess, but it's like I kind of know where everything is. So, um, yeah. And I think I'm also excited for, well, I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm interested to see like during Mars retrograde in Gemini this
Mm-hmm.
year. I feel like that could be a good crafting time or like a time of restarting projects that maybe you like frogged and things like that
Mm.
because yeah, I feel like I attribute a lot of my crafting to my mercurial Mars because it's like the energy that I need to get out ends up like going out through my hands basically.
Yes.
Um
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, like I was gonna say, like, yeah, speaking of like Mars and Virgo and like all this stuff, like how do you see your, yeah, like crafting like coming out in your chart? So like I definitely agree about Mercury Mars stuff. I have Mercury in Gemini, sextile Mars and Moon in Aries.
Mhm.
So I really feel you on that, just like needing to do stuff with your hands to like kind of get this
Yep.
out, and like you just have this stuff that needs to like physically kind of emerge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I wasn't knitting, like I definitely have issues with like cuticle picking or like I feel like
Mm.
some people like bite their nails. It's like a nervous energy that I feel like kind of comes out with and my Mars is also like conjunct the North Node, so I feel like it kind of amplifies like the
Oh yeah.
anxious tendencies. And having something that's constructive, like this is going back to the malefic, like insect malefic kind of thing because my
Mm-hmm.
Mars is in a night chart. So I feel like it's like I want something constructive to do with that sometimes destructive energy. But
Yeah.
and then my Mars is also opposite my Venus in Pisces in the fifth house, which like but that opposition I feel has a lot of relating to like being an art teacher and crafting, like the fifth house being like crafting and hobbies and
Mm-hmm.
also children. And then both of them are like trine and sextile my moon in Cancer in the ninth house. So I feel like the moon being there and kind of like reconciling the opposition definitely feels like it relates to crafting as well because it's like kind of a passed down skill.
Mm.
Um, and I feel like it's also very like I talked a lot about how I connect to it through like the cyclical nature of crafting um and the repetitive nature of it, and that's kind of how the moon works. Like it's our closest celestial body. We know its cycles very well, and they're like the repetition and daily change of the moon kind of feels like it relates to that the ways that we like repeat a certain pattern or action in order to create something in the end.
Mm.
How do you so do you feel like your Aries how do you feel like your Aries moon shows up with that with crafting?
Huh. How do I think that shows up? I think like enjoying like making my own patterns and like making modifications to stuff. Like I think that Aries kind of like I just always want to try something new type thing.
Mhm.
Like I always want to, I feel like, try to like there is a competitive nature of sorts to it. I try to keep it in check. But because like again, I've talked before about naming my business for Arachne. Like she's an inspiration and a cautionary tale. Like I think she's a
Mhm.
great figure to look at for like humility as a like key thing, with
Yeah.
talent. And so because it's like I always want to that plus like having an Aquarius fifth house. It's like I want to challenge myself and I want to compete against myself almost to
Mhm.
do better and to do more every time, and to like blaze trails kind of in a way. Like, how can I combine this into a new and interesting thing? Or what's a new take I can do on this? Aries, astrological new year, fresh start kind of stuff. So, yeah, I guess
Yeah.
that's how I would say it probably comes up.
Yeah, I relate to that too because my Mars in Virgo is ruled by Mercury and Aries, and they're like in
Ah,
antition with each other. So there's
okay.
like kind of yeah, there's kind of like a communication between that feel. Like I have always felt like I mentioned this to you before, but I knit with like a group of older women who
Mm-hmm.
like have been knitting for so long, and they always follow the pattern. Like they're very pattern following people for the most
Yeah.
part. And I am not that at all. Like even if I try to follow a pattern, I'm like I need to do some kind of modification to this. Like there's something that I don't quite like. Or
Yeah.
even just like I don't want to buy that much yarn, so I'm going to like
Mm.
buy less, and then if it's like makes it too short or something, it'll be a crop top. Like it's just kind of like the modifications happen whether I like it or not a lot of the time. That's just kind of how I feel like I am with that. So that's why I've liked doing these custom things because it's like I'm creating the pattern and it's new every time because it's
Mm.
custom.
Right.
So, I don't have to like I can look at patterns for inspiration, but I don't have to follow it to a T to know what I'm doing. And I feel like that's an important feeling. Like going back to the agency, like as a kid, I feel like I kind of learned that when I first learned knitting because I like never really followed any patterns. I remember making these gloves that were like they were not great, like very well made, but
Sure.
like I figured out how to do it on my own and how to like decrease and just kind of like make them these weird square kind of mittens and like I did not follow a pattern and they did not look amazing, but I figured it out on my own. I feel like that was kind of like the lesson that I learned.
And that's so important. Like, it's really important to make a bunch of quote unquote bad stuff. Like, you
Yeah.
need to like have sketches and samples and just work on something. And then some of the things that I've learned a lot from are things that I worked it up and I kind of looked at it for a bit, and then I frogged the whole thing and then wrapped the whole yarn back up. But just the experience of doing that, experimenting and fucking around with it, I learned something, you know
Yeah.
and making bad gloves, like, is better than making no gloves, like,
Hmm.
and you figured it out yourself. And that's so important, I think, for kids. Like, they need space to actually figure stuff out and to actually, like, constructively struggle with things a bit. Like, I've
Hmm.
seen people talking about, like, if your kids want to learn how to pour juice, like, try to work that out with them. Like, get, a juice bottle full of water or something, and like give them like a space where they can practice that and practice those skills, and
Hmm.
like let them like feel that like excitement of like succeeding, of like, yes, like
Yeah.
I did this myself, because that's like the biggest reward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I talk a lot about with like the sixth house year when you're 5 and it's like your first time in kindergarten. Because something that I've
Mm,
heard teachers say is like you should practice, like give your child a lunch before they go to school for the first time and like help
yeah.
have them practice opening everything by themselves and make sure that like they're all things that a child can open on their own because it gives them like more of a feeling of like that they're independent and
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of important when they're being like home alone for the or away from home for the longest time that they like would be up to that point.
Yeah.
So it's just little things like that because otherwise it's like I've been like subbing for the kindergarten teacher before and then you have like 5 kids coming up to you asking you to open something and it's like that's fine and it's fine to do that
Sure.
but I feel like they would feel a lot better if they could open it themselves. So
Yeah.
it's like those kinds of little things that are kind of like there's another thing that the like pedagogy of art teaching that I use is teaching artistic behaviors and they um I'm like on a Facebook group for it and they
Mm-hmm.
will post these like art traps that they've done in their classroom. So it's
Okay.
like they don't give any instructions about how to do it necessarily, but it could be like there's cut out pieces of paper and like there's a couple of them are already put on like a bulletin board or something so that
Mm-hmm.
it's like there it's just kind of there and you know that you can use everything in this room independently so here are materials laid out that I'm not going to tell you what to do with them but if you want to figure it out and play around with it then that's up to you to try it so yeah.
Yeah, like, and that, I love that phrasing, like an art trap. Like, just like setting this like positive bait, and just like seeing what they, and like for me, like I have to say, as like I'm very much a like, I want to follow a pattern like the first time, but then after
Yeah.
that, then I'm like ready to like innovate on it. And so like
Mhm.
for me, like as a kid, I would have really appreciated the like, here's an example of how you can do this. Like here's some pieces. So if you just imitate this, like congratulations, like you did the thing.
Yeah.
But you can also just go
Mhm.
wild with it. And some kids are going to immediately do that first. But you just give them
Yes.
options. But yeah, it's
Mhm.
just an opportunity to be creative.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
then also like having like you're saying about following a pattern first, it's like also having a model to follow can be helpful because you
Mm.
need some kind of structure to be able to like succeed in your experimentation too.
Yeah.
Like it's hard to just experiment without any structure behind the experimentation sometimes.
Right.
And I feel like that's also a big like learning lesson that I've had with my Mars Venus opposition is it's like there has to be a balance between like the taking action and like the thinking about it or like the reality of it and the fantasy of it and like
Mm.
figuring out the balance is kind of the most like the best end goal of any situation, even if it's like maybe the thing that you made didn't turn out so well but you learned how not to like increase this time or something like that.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, fantasy, especially for Venus and Pisces, great word. Um,
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, because you talk about Venus as like kind of artistic taste, like maybe aesthetic, like which I
Hmm.
always think is interesting because like a lot of times I feel like there is a difference between maybe what you like versus what you actually do or like what you actually put on yourself. Like I'm very much a person where like there are a lot of like aesthetics that like I really appreciate and that I really like, and I'm like, wow, this is really like magnetizing for like whatever reason, but like it's not something that I would personally like have in my house or like a clothing style that I would apply to myself. And
Yeah.
so it's like having these different kind of taste things. So Venus and Pisces, I guess, what do you feel like that brings out in you and like in art?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like Venus is like pretty tightly trying my moon too, and
Mm.
so I feel like in terms of aesthetic, like I'm looking around my apartment and stuff and like thinking about like art that I made in like art school in college, and I feel like a lot of it was like very connected to childhood or some kind of nostalgia.
Mm.
Um and like nostalgia is also an interesting thing because it has an element of fantasy to it. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're
Oh
imagining
yeah.
something in the past, but like it's kind of like tinged with some like extra fairy dust or something. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely not like exactly the reality of how it was, but you're
Yeah,
kind
the
of like
soft
romanticizing a
focus.
past.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so, yeah, I feel like that's definitely something that comes up for me a lot in terms of like things that I connect to artistically and like aesthetically. And I feel like I attribute that to I mean, it's two like dignified planets. Like Venus is exalted in Pisces and it's trine my domiciled moon. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they both kind of get into each other's feelings in a way. Like the
Mm.
nostalgia and the aesthetics of nostalgia are and like and beyond like just nostalgia, it's also like comfort. Like I think a lot about like just like the comfort of something that's handmade or something that you like put a lot of effort into. Like I have this granny square blanket from my like I don't know who made it in my family, but like my grandma or maybe my grandma's sister or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it just like when I'm like having it on me when I'm in bed, it's like I'm thinking about that someone like took so much time to make each of these squares with their own hands, and
Mm.
now it's something that I can like envelop myself in. I feel like that also kind of relates to the like exalted nature of Venus and Pisces is it's like the
Ooh.
things that someone takes the time to make for you are so important
Yeah.
because it's like that sense of being like a distinguished guest as an exalted planet. It's like this is a gift for you,
Mm.
and like as someone that's also a crafter, those things that are handmade are so important to me because I know like the time and effort that was put into it. So yeah, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but
Yeah, I mean it's very Venus and Pisces kind of like presenting this whole sort of like tableau of possible answers and options. Like yeah, no, I mean I think it's I can definitely I think nostalgia is really a big keyword I would say for crafting in general because I think like if you talk to a lot of people when you ask them what they like about, let's say even if we just restricted to crochet and knitting, what do you like about this? Well, it reminds me of this blanket that my grandmother made me. It reminds me
yeah.
of my mom made this stuff. It reminds me of, whoever in my life that made these things. It reminds me of going to like my aunt and uncle's house and they had,
Mhm.
these like throw blankets. Like it is nostalgia. It is history.
Yeah.
It is coziness. It is this evoking history,
Mhm.
that I think people find so appealing. And so I feel like there's definitely a Saturnian component to crafting as
Yeah.
well, like making things that last.
Yeah. That's interesting because I tend to ignore Saturn many times. Saturn's my like out of sex malefic, but
Sure.
Saturn rules my fourth house and my third house, so I feel like those are both very like ancestry related houses.
Mm.
And it definitely feels like that's a connection for sure that I definitely feel, and like the oldness of some like handmade things that are passed down. Like I had someone make me a quilt, and my mom was like, "That's gonna be heirloom quality," and I love that word, like heirloom for like
Mm.
Saturn and like Saturn ruling my fourth house because it's like the things that you can pass down that are also extremely special but may be
Yeah.
used like on an everyday basis at the same time.
Right.
um yeah.
Like, yeah, like the that's I think one of the biggest things like that I try to do with my work like is, I want them to be beautiful things, but I also want them to be integrated into daily life. Like, one
Yes.
of the things that I think is so profound about crafting is that you can have beautiful things and you can make them, or somebody that you love can make them for you, or an artist can make them for you. And it's so different having this beautiful thing in your house that didn't come from a machine or that didn't come from like a luxury house or like whatever, that
Yeah.
the luxury of the thing is that somebody took the time to make
Yeah,
it
and
for you.
care.
Yeah, like the love of it. Like I know I quote this like there's this D.H. Lawrence quote that I bring up a lot in reference to this kind of thing. But like yeah, like I've talked about this before like having like a Venus Saturn trine like in earth signs. Like this is
Mm.
like what this is what I love about doing what I do. Like this is why like when I found, a lot more like vintage patterns and started getting more into the kind of like historical sides of it and, being able to be like, wow, like I'm working this pattern that was, published in this booklet from 19, 19 or something like that, and I'm
Mhm.
working the same thing that people were working over 100 years ago. And like this thing that I made is like the same, it's like we're connected through time. Like we're
Yes.
separated by so much else, but like it makes me like really like emotional
Yeah.
just thinking about it, and just like that
Yeah.
like transmission throughout time. I found
Mhm.
the quote. So it's things men have made with wakened hands and put soft life into are awake through years with transferred touch and go on glowing for
Mm.
long years. And for this
Oh,
reason, some old things are lovely warm still with the life of forgotten men who made them.
Yes.
Like, and I'm just like, I'm
Yes,
getting
that's so
like,
beautiful.
this is the thing, is like the feeling of like crafting. And like, I think this is why it's really difficult sometimes to like price this stuff, like to do it as a
Yeah.
business, because like, how do you account for love? Where does love go
Yeah.
in on the supplies and materials list? Where does
Yeah.
passion go?
Yes. Yeah, I actually while I was in college and like doing my art ed degree and like making
Mm,
granny squares, I also like tacked on an extra thing to do a thesis. And
okay.
I wrote a thesis about like including um like crafting and fiber arts into arts education because I felt like I never had that when I was a child. Like it wasn't considered art to be like knitting, and it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
something that I did in art class. Um, and yeah, a lot of what you're talking about was many of the things that I like wrote about in my thesis, like the connection over time and like generational ties and like it's like cross cultural and like uh, you know over time and over different places and different cultures, like
Yeah.
this has been something that's been connecting us. And even like if you don't have anyone in your family who has knit or crafted in any way, like it's still something that we're constantly surrounded with, like
Mm-hmm.
fabric, and just like we are always connected to fabric in some physical way. And it's the things that are like also providing us comfort in many ways are like
Mm.
fabric bound things. um and there was also the quote that you said reminded me of like the arpilleras in Chile in like the 1970s when
Mm.
there were people that were like getting disappeared during the dictatorship, and women would like create these what's the word for that, applique,
Mm.
like quilts. But I don't know if quilts is the right word because they were kind of smaller than that, but they were like
Yeah.
applique sewing out of their like disappeared husbands or brothers or sons' clothes. And they were depicting like what was happening during the dictatorship, and they would smuggle them out in order to like get the rest of the world to know what was
Mm.
happening there.
Wow.
So I feel like there's also like so many revolutionary histories of crafting as well that like also tie us in this physical way to this art form that has kind of like always been like a method of both comfort and utilitarianism, but also like revolution and like speaking your mind in a way too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, absolutely. Like, that's I yeah. If you have any like links or anything to share about those applique pieces, like if you have them later, I can share them with folks as well. But I'd really love to learn more because, like, yeah, there's this really strange, disheartening kind of devaluation of, I think, crafts among a lot of people. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think especially post kind of like industrialization and like,
Yes.
like
Yes.
ready to wear clothes and
Yes.
all of this stuff, chemical dyes and everything. Like, I did
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite classes that I ever took in college was a like Victorian era like science, like talking about the like history of science and like talking about the invention of like chemical dyes and just how like
Mm-hmm.
bug nuts everybody went for like having like these loud colored fabrics, like the plaids and the stripes and the just like the reveling in color, that was available to us. But we don't think about that now because all we see is like black and white maybe, or like all of these kind of illustrations maybe if you're lucky. But
Was that
um
was that like the last Neptune and Pisces transit?
That
Was it like during the late 1800s?
it would have been, yeah. Let me double check.
Because I'm thinking like that was the like the spiritualism movement that was during Neptune in Pisces in the late 1800s. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's kind of if that's also connected with that. But Yeah, I've been taking a natural dyes class, and it's definitely making me think a lot more about how I want the whole process of making these astro knit garments to go,
Mm-hmm.
because like I right now I'm using like wool from, like nice um hand dyed wool, but from a company. I'm not like dyeing it myself.
Right.
But that's something that I would like to be doing in the future, but it's just I don't know if I have the time or space for that, like to be hand dyeing everything that I make, but it's definitely like a goal for sure.
Yeah. I mean,
Because
it
I
would
feel like
be.
that's something
Go ahead.
I feel like that, I feel like that's something that like I was just talking with someone about like the quality of yarn, and like lots of people will just use acrylic because it's cheap, but it's like literally plastic, and I feel like that's something that like we don't always realize, like even yarn is made out of plastic at this like stage in capitalism. So
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, it's kind of a difficult like line between demanding like higher quality um, things, and but also like not being able to afford those kinds of things because of the world that we live in. Like,
Yeah.
um, but it's like it's um, like what you're saying about fast fashion and stuff. Like you're receiving a better garment that will last longer if it's handmade and like
Mm-hmm.
custom fit for you, but um, it's way more expensive because of the
Yeah.
labor and the effort that's put into it. But it's gonna last longer and not go into a landfill like when you're done with it. So
Yeah, well, exactly. And it's like, and even for stuff that is disposable, I think that, or relatively disposable, like, I don't know, washcloths, I think of, like something like that. Like, how many knit washcloths? Like, I don't know how many washcloths you've knit, but I've knit a lot of washcloths. Like, but it's like, even though it is technically like a disposable item, the fact that it was handmade makes you want to take better care of your things, all of your things,
yeah.
because you're like, I really need to make this last. Like, but I know that it is capable of lasting.
Mhm.
I looked it up. So the first synthetic dye apparently was Malvine, which was discovered in 1856.
Huh.
So yeah, Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces.
And was Uranus in Gemini?
Let's see. Uranus was in Taurus, actually. So happy
Oh, okay,
Uranus
so that's
return, I
the
guess.
same. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Huh.
oh, and it was actually Uranus conjunct Pallas in Taurus.
Oh. Oh,
So
that's
kind
so
of
interesting.
interesting. Yeah, with Venus. Where's Venus? Venus in
Uranus
Gemini.
conjunct Pallas. Okay. Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. The
So,
Uranus like being a part of that configuration makes a lot of sense for like the bright colors and the
yeah. Well, and it was an accident,
more.
it says too, that it was discovered while
Oh
this
my god.
chemist was attempting to synthesize quinine for the treatment of malaria and ended up making this bright purple dye.
Oh my god.
Like, come on. And
Yeah,
purple?
and it
Like,
being
hello?
bright purple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That's amazing.
Yeah. So, but it's gosh, that's an angle I hadn't even thought about. It's like looking at like Neptune. I guess probably Uranus and Neptune as far as like fashion trends kind of go,
Mhm.
you know. Because I'm like, is that something that would be useful? Because I think about what are other ways that you apply astrology to crafting and to making? And that's one of those things. Like, is being able to try to predict trends, like
Yeah.
trying to look forward and be like, okay, what are we looking at? Like how are things going to change up? Especially I think with like, Uranus and Taurus, Venus ruled stuff. I mean, we've seen a lot, but there's also a lot of just going back to it's been really interesting seeing like 70s stuff come back again for like the second time in
Hmm.
my lifetime, because like you remember when there was that like late 90s kind of 70s revival, like, and now I've seen all the memes now where it's like, oh, like, is anybody gonna tell Gen Z about like having like rain soaked flares like slapping against your
Yeah.
ankles for like hours at a time and like stepping on your like pant hems, but like it's all back again.
Yeah. Yeah, I've also thought a lot about using like I would like to use astrology to kind of like chart the history of craft also,
Mm,
but I don't know, like I feel like I need to do more like research into the history of craft, and like craft as an umbrella is such a wide term too, because while
yeah.
you're talking about Uranus and Taurus, it's also making me think about like people have been talking a lot about like shortages of food,
Mm,
like things like that that have to do with food, and that's
yeah,
also a craft in and of itself. Like cooking and baking is also crafting.
absolutely.
um and so yeah, just trying to understand like what planets like relate to what parts of craft, or
Mm-hmm.
I also have been thinking, like I think knitting was kind of invented around the same time that astrology was beginning to be used. Like
Oh,
it's also a very old craft. I'm not positive
yeah.
about that, but um, so just kind of like thinking about the ways that the ebbs and flows of history relate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's something that I've wanted to like learn more about, but it's hard to find a place to start, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, cause like now I'm thinking about like, yeah, like looking at when crafts kind of started or became popularized or whatever, like speaking to those periods of time. Cause like I do tatting, for example, and that is a pretty new craft, relatively speaking.
Oh,
Like, I
yeah,
think it
and
only
then like you were
really.
talking about the
Go
oh
ahead.
sorry. You were talking about like the 70s revival, and like macrame also
Mm-hmm.
coming back seems like
Yeah.
another thing to look into. And then like
Yeah.
the arts and crafts movement in like the early 1900s. So, yeah, I'd like to look into that more.
Right, yeah, because it's like, and like with I keep thinking about with the like 70s stuff, I guess it's kind of really more 60s stuff, but like S.J. Anderson has talked about like the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio as being
Mm,
related to that kind of like, 60s sort of, like a lot of the kind of natural aesthetic coming back with the North Node in Taurus, the like much more
yeah.
grounded kind of like you see people talking about like clean girl makeup and whatever, like
Mm.
more like quote unquote natural type stuff. And
Yeah,
so
and that's
yeah.
interesting. That's interesting in relation to what we were just talking about with synthetic dyes, because I've
Mm-hmm.
also, I mean, maybe this is just like the people that I follow on the internet, but I feel like
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of um, like natural dyeing, not just natural dyeing, but like eco printing, like people doing
Mm.
eco printing workshops and them being very popular. And as those the eco printing like is an interesting place to think about that as well, because it's like
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying about the North Node in Taurus, but then also what we were talking about before about Uranus in Taurus, and kind
Mm-hmm.
of like they're still bringing out bright colors, but it's like in a more natural way. But I think that that's kind of like a side of the world that is kind of more interested in finding alternatives to the like industrial kind of force upon crafting
Mm-hmm.
and dyeing fabrics, and like the syntheticization. I don't know if that's a word, but
Yeah.
of kind of like craft materials over like since Uranus was in Taurus the last time.
Yeah, and it's definitely something that I think about, like with stuff that I do. Like this is not naturally dyed thread.
Yeah.
This that I'm working on here is a very, this is just good old Aunt Lydia's crochet thread from like Michael's,
Hmm.
very conventionally dyed.
Yeah.
Like I would love to like eventually start making some stuff in like nicer materials, like get some like fine like linen thread maybe, like and work stuff more naturally, like do some natural dyeing. But it's it's hard when like you're used to kind of a certain amount of availability of things, and
Yes.
like it really constricts the amount of colors that you have available. Like I feel like I'm kind of going in
Hmm.
reverse of like people going from natural to synthetic dyes. I'm like, wow, like okay, what do you do when, is there any way to get this like wild highlighter yellow, for example, that I have as like part of this thread blend?
Yeah.
But it's also about finding like, all right, well, what am I? And this is something that I think about with Saturn a lot. Excuse me, my voice is cracking a lot recently. Uh that I think about with Saturn a lot, which is like, what are you like, where are you willing to like decenter yourself and like remove yourself and almost deny yourself, or like kind of
Mhm.
take charge of your desires in a way. And so that can be, restricting yourself from, using a lot of like conventionally dyed, type stuff, or, towards picking more like sustainable options,
Hmm.
using less but of better quality, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of like what you're saying about Saturn, but then the color, like the vibrancy of color too, and like Saturn being kind of like a muting
Mm.
sort of planet. So like you
Oh,
sometimes
that's
have to
so
like,
true.
yeah, you kind of have to like forego some of the brightness of color that's maybe like more Uranian or Jupiterian in order to like be more sustainable or conscious of your
Mm.
um, choices in terms of like how you're affecting the environment, but then that creates like a different effect that's more Saturnian, possibly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, man, that's a really good point. Yeah, like Saturn is literally just kind of taking the color out of things.
Hmm.
But I mean, like, I also do really love working stuff in just like, a nice plain like cream color, and there is just that beauty in looking at, one of the things that I love about lace, and I think this is that like Mercury, definitely big Mercury stuff, is like all the little fine details, which can get lost sometimes in like really bright colors.
Hmm.
Like, whereas, if I were to work something like this that I'm working on in like, a plain like cream, or white, or, just a single color, the attention goes more to, all right, looking at it, it definitely makes, your stitches more visible and more of kind of the center focus, if you will. So it's easier to see mistakes, like if you have one
Yeah.
tiny little, it's much more visible, I feel like, in kind of a big sort of blank slate, kind of like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting though also because I do sometimes feel like Mercury can be associated with some of the like well, one thing that I love about knitting and crocheting is like choosing a yarn that has some kind of a colorway and
Mm.
then figuring like seeing in the end how it turns out based on like because you could pull those out like and change the amount of stitches that you cast on or like do the pattern in a different way and the way that the colors line up will be completely different than
Mm-hmm.
like one pattern versus another. So I feel like that also the pattern that the color makes on its own is another kind of like mercurial detail
Mm.
oriented aspect to that. Um, and I guess maybe that's also part of like a question of Mercury in which signs. Like, do you want
Right.
to see more of like the details of the work that you put into it, or do you want to see more of like the experimentation of how the color turned out based on the different colors that were in the colorway and how they stripe, how they do like self striping and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's one that like just really seems like straight up like wizardry to me. It's like how people figure out like self-striping lengths for like yarn.
Yeah.
Like I know that there's like a bunch of math behind it and it's like figuring out, but it's like how do you make it work for like, I know that most of the time, especially for like sock yarn, for example, they kind of assume a like average circumference of like a sock that you're going to make. But,
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of times though still it's still very like, very flexible. But yeah, seeing how colors like pool
Yes.
sometimes, I actually had, let me see on this piece that I just finished earlier. So it's all these rainbow colors, but there was part where it kind of lined up again really well. Um, yeah, there's these sort of, I'll show it here on the Twitch side, but I've got these like long arcs of green coming through here where it's continued up kind of from the bottom. Or there's one of my, hey, Oscar, but I know. Can you find somewhere else to hang out, please? A little cat wrangling. Um, but yeah, like that's one of the things that I really like about working with this stuff, though, is just like seeing, yeah, like you said, like how the colors kind of, how things come out and how it plays out.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, let me see. I know that we had like a whole little doc of stuff. Um, Oh, yeah. So I wanted to talk about like cuz I like to talk about the stuff with like some kind of like actionability, I guess, behind it or some kind of like invitation to, like here's something you can try to sort of like integrate this yourself. So like, I had a note about like how can the average person use astrology to influence their crafts, like somebody
Hmm.
who's, let's say, like familiar with, with their big three, maybe with all their planets, just, like understands what Venus and Mercury kind of signify. Like, where can people start with sort of looking deeper into this?
Yeah, so one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is I want to make patterns for people to be able to like do planetary related garments themselves.
Mm,
And when I was thinking about that, I was like, how can I kind of incorporate what I'm doing with electing for certain charts for specific people and for custom garments?
mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, like, if I were to make a pattern based on Venus, then I would write in the pattern instructions, like, you should start this maybe during sunrise on a Friday because that's Venus hour.
Right.
So, working with the planetary days and hours is a good way of kind of doing that. And I think it depends on your chart. Like, we've talked about a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different, like, kind of how all of the planets relate to crafting in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like for instance, if you feel like you maybe craft more in order to make things that are aesthetically pleasing and maybe like you have Venus and Libra, then you might want to like craft during Venus hour, especially when Venus is in Libra or on Fridays because that's Venus day. Whereas if you feel like you craft because it connects you to like your ancestry or like a comfort feeling, then maybe you want to
Mm-hmm.
do it during like moon day is Monday or during like moon hours. Um, or like we were also talking about the Mercury ruled Mars and like having something to do with your hands. Like, so thinking about like maybe doing that during Wednesday or Mercury's day. So I feel like the planetary hours and days are a good way. Like, it kind of, I think it doesn't feel, or I think maybe it wouldn't be like construed as a beginner type of thing if you don't know too much about astrology, but it's pretty easy
Sure.
to figure out. There's like, I don't know if you want to put this link in the chat, but like
Mm-hmm.
planetaryhours.net
Oh,
is a good,
yes.
yeah, just simple website. It just shows you the planetary hours for that day, and then just to run down like the planetary days. I think like I always it's very easy for me to think of them, the like translating the days to Spanish. Also, I feel like
Mm.
some of the planets like they're fit better with them in Spanish, but like Monday for Moon Day is good in English. But Tuesday is Mars Day, Wednesday is Mercury's Day, Thursday is Jupiter's Day, Friday is Venus Day, Saturday is Saturn's Day, which you can hear that, and then Sunday is the Sun's Day, which you can also hear very well. So like those I feel like are easy, um, kind of like, and like maybe you are always working on a certain quilt during Venus Day because it's a quilt that you want to look very nice, or maybe you're always working on a garment or a blanket for yourself that you're knitting on Moon Day because it's a repetitive kind of action that you're taking to make the like granny squares. I would love to do like a granny square blanket that I only work on Moon Day, and then it's very
Mm.
comfortable in the end, and you've kind of created these like cyclical patterns that go sort of in a square type of circle. So um, I think that's one way to do it, or to connect those two things. I don't know if you have other ones that you were thinking about, but that's one that I'm excited about.
Yeah, like I think that that's really like that's I think really a great place to start. Yeah, is like, if you're trying to like do any kind of planning, honestly, if you're trying to experiment with astrology in your life in different ways, like I really find the planetary hours a helpful way to do that because I do
Mm-hmm.
find that the quality of the day, like using that as a point to start with experimentation, like if you can have planetary hours up, and if you're maybe a little more intermediate, or if you feel like you can handle the extra data, pull up a like transit chart of the moment on like AstroDeanst or AstroSeek or whatever, see what the ascendant is like, see where the midheaven is and the moon and all of this stuff, and just see kind of what the combined qualities of those are. Just make a note of it as you craft. Be like, okay, when I started
Mm-hmm.
working on this, this is what hour it was, this is what, maybe the ascendant and the moon and Venus were doing. Make a note of that, and then continue to look at those notes over time and continue to see how your work changes over time as you experiment with different timing and different placements and everything.
Yeah.
And, just getting to know it, because you have to see how it works for you personally.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is what astrology is developing a personal relationship, I
Yeah.
find with like the stars and planets. And so, you have to ultimately do the personal work to figure out how it's really relevant for you and how it really shows up for you. Like streaming crafting for me is the perfect thing for my Mercury Mars situation. Like, talking and crafting at the same time, like just I have all of this energy to use, like,
Mm-hmm.
and but I need a place to channel it, and so doing something like this is great because my hands can be busy, and while my hands are busy, it takes care of sort of that background, like 5-year old that's always in there, like they're busy, and so then I can carry on conversations and like stay on track and stay engaged with something.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I
yeah.
feel like the what you're describing also is like another connection that I feel with like teaching, because uh, like definitely in schools now more than when I was a kid, like fidget toys are kind of a
Mm,
big thing that are like allowed and accepted and encouraged for
yeah.
kids, like the poppets and stuff. And I feel like that's what knitting is for me. Like it's a fidget
Yes.
toy, basically.
Yeah, oh my
So,
God, that like makes so much sense because like when I hit, I think it was high school. It was high school when I learned to knit. And I just always had knitting with me. Like I
yep.
always had it in my bag, and anytime I was sitting down, if I didn't have a book, I was knitting because I needed something to do. Like I couldn't just sit there still.
Yeah.
Like I needed to be doing something mercurial, either reading or doing something with my hands.
Mhm.
And like I think about that, like this is another thing historically, is like how many neurodivergent people, how many people with anxiety, how many of these people that were like us crafted for the same reasons. Like when I see
Mhm.
stuff about like knitting purses and crochet purses and like you know pictures and like paintings of like people walking around with their little like crafting belt on and just walking and crafting at the same time. I'm like, that's
Yeah.
probably what I would have been doing. Like,
Yeah.
I probably would have been walking around constantly with some kind of project on me or something to
Mhm.
fidget with and to fuss with and to mercury with.
Yeah, and I feel like it also makes me think about like the like gendered implications as well,
Yeah.
and like the whole idea of like hysteria. And I think like
Hmm.
fiber arts was like said to be a cure for hysteria for some time, which
Really?
like yeah, I mean yeah, it's I think that I feel like that I read that in some of my research while I was working
Yeah.
on my thesis, but it definitely kind of makes sense. Like, I don't think that it was as logical for like it was just kind of like this is a women's craft, so it's gonna cure like this women's issue or something.
Sure.
But like,
Yeah,
so I'm
like
sure
all
there
of the
was
fiber
gonna have
crafts are
like
just gonna soak up the horny and like you'll just purge it
yeah,
from your system. Like,
yeah. So I wouldn't say that it was like pure intentions, but now we are like using this as something that is like helpful for like neurodivergence and like anxiety and like I just feel like it's like an over concentration of energy in my hands like based on
mm-hmm.
my chart. That's how it kind of feels sometimes. So
Yeah. Yeah, like it's there's it's something that people do for a lot of different reasons. Like,
mhm.
there are people who do it, for work, for play, for stress relief, for anxiety relief, for, any number of reasons, but like it's such a personal relationship that you have with your craft. Like, I feel like it is something that like technically you could learn to sit down and to knit just to produce items, let's say, and
Yeah,
I guess not have like a passion for it, but I don't understand what that would be like. I guess like I feel like it's something that, since it's a fifth house thing, since it's a Venusian thing, like I feel like I don't know, I can't imagine doing something like this and not having this like feeling of like love or passion or like fulfillment or something, like I think I feel, when I'm doing this, like how other people feel like when they're gardening, maybe,
hmm,
like sitting and kind of tending to something with my hands and watching it grow and then kind of sitting back and being like, oh, like instead of I grew these peppers, it's like, I made these, mitts or whatever, like I got
yeah.
to participate in the act of creation.
Yes. Yeah, and I think like the kind of like sense of accomplishment at the end of creating something is a big thing,
Hmm.
and feeling like you kind of were able to have the discipline to like that's something that I've learned from teaching knitting and crocheting. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a very you really have to like put in a lot of effort to learn it. Like it's kind of a
Yeah.
difficult thing to learn because there's so many different aspects to it that are just kind of like small details, like the way when you're like knitting, it's like the way that you wrap your yarn, if you're wrapping it around like away from you or towards you, and how you're
Yeah.
holding your hands, and like the fact that you need to kind of like hold the knitting needles higher up in order to like not let the stitches fall off, and like all of those little details that you have to learn by practicing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was something like I used to teach knitting and crocheting in Cook County Jail.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like a big reason that we brought up for like justifying the program basically because there was a lot of like pushback, but I feel like that's something that you learn life skills through knitting and crocheting of like patience and like having, you know, like resilience also. Yeah, you made a
Mm.
mistake or you dropped a stitch or something, but you can put it back on, and like fixing mistakes. Like it's very small like learning of those things and
Yeah.
a very like physical learning of those types of things, but
Yeah.
I feel like it helps you to be able to be more resilient when you make mistakes like in life in general, to know that like you can just pull something out and you have the ability to like stick it back on your needles and keep going, and like
Mm.
um and then the sense of accomplishment of like sticking to something even though you had to pull it out and like continuing it so that you could finish it and feel the like um culmination at the end of something that you spent a lot of time and effort on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would really be interested to hear more about that, about working in that program, and like, I'm curious, what's the relationship between Lord of the Fifth and Lord of the 12th? I mean,
Yeah, that's, oh my God, I never actually even thought of that. Well, it's not well, yeah, it's Venus is in my fifth and ruling my 12th, but that makes a lot of sense.
ah, yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Um yeah, and like I said, I feel like that is a big like teach part of my teaching, like a teaching aspect of my
mm-hmm,
chart is like Venus being in the fifth, but in that case it wasn't like children, it was women who were in prison, which is also a Venus ruling the 12th kind of thing.
right,
Um, so yeah, I really enjoyed that program, and like honestly it was very interesting because like I was um we had to like finish the program had to end because of COVID basically. Like
mm,
when COVID happened we couldn't go in anymore and
yeah,
all of the volunteer programs were canceled. But before, like right before the pandemic, I was working as an assistant teacher for kindergarten at that time, and it was a school that was like very expensive. Um, and then on the weekends, like on Sunday, we would go to the jail and teach knitting. Um, and part of, I think the thing that sometimes people don't realize about jail also is like jail and prison are different, and jail
right,
is like not a long term place, or it's not supposed to be, even though it is for many people.
yeah,
It's like supposed to be where you go before you like go to trial, if if that's something that you're going to do, or you like take a plea bargain. So a lot of times we would be teaching someone, and then the next week we would show up and they weren't there because they don't know when their court dates are going to be. Like they get told them pretty last minute a lot of the time.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so it was just very interesting, the contrast of like the women in the jail were like sort of more it's not like respectful isn't the right word, but like appreciative of us being there and teaching them, whereas like the
mm-hmm,
kindergartners who were like going to this very expensive school, like, you know, were not treating their teachers with very much like appreciation.
yeah,
um and just kind of like the difference in that kind of understanding of like what someone is there to do, and especially when it's like the people who are in jail maybe had like other understandings of teachers throughout their lives, like they had already
mm,
been through school, they're older, and like some of them were pretty old, and like maybe they didn't have great relationships with their teachers growing up, but now they're in a different context where like someone is volunteering to come in and teach them this thing, and some of them were very resistant, like
mm-hmm,
they, and because of that feeling of like this is difficult and it looks easy, like someone else is
yeah,
doing this thing and they're doing it so quickly, they're doing it without looking, and I can't
right,
even like wrap the yarn the right way. Like at first that feels like sort of like uh what's the word for that, like you don't feel very confident in yourself because it's
yeah, it's
difficult at first.
demoralizing,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, but then like that's part of the learning experience is like, you know, it takes time and it takes effort, and a lot of the women like put in a lot of effort and time and like patience in order to learn it in the end, and they were like so proud of themselves when they did.
mm-hmm,
Um because they have like a final product that they can be like, you know, they would be able to send their things to their families, so they might make something for like their children and then send them. um and so also being able, like when you're in this context where you feel like you have like there's nothing more for people to take from you and you have nothing more to give, but now
yeah,
you've like learned a new skill that you can create things for other people and to give to other people. um So yeah, I miss like I miss it a lot because I don't know where a lot of those women like are now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we tried to create like a system for when they got out that they could come and knit with us, but it was kind of like the logistics of that can be difficult because like when you've just gotten out of jail and you're trying to find a job and you don't necessarily have transportation and things
Yeah.
like that, and you're like trying to find childcare. So, and then of course, like COVID happened as we were trying to get like more support for people that were coming out. So it's been, yeah, it's been like I think I'm hoping that we can restart the program, but it's definitely like there are things that need to be changed in order for it to be productive again, I think, or
Mm-hmm.
supportive.
Hmm. Yeah, it's just it was really when you mentioned that being something that you'd done, like it was something that I hadn't really even thought about happening in prisons, like being offered. And there's just this real sense of agency with crafting. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, like being able to control that and being able to be like, you know what, I made this. I
Yeah.
did this. Like, and I put in the time to learn how to do this and everything, and I put in the effort, and I picked the colors, and I did this. This was me.
Yeah.
And like you can't take that from me. Like,
Yeah.
I have this creative skill, you
Hmm.
know. Um
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about with the patterns was also another interesting thing to kind of like watch happening while teaching in the jail because
mhm.
like I think we had some pattern books in there, but we didn't very often teach women how to read patterns because that's a whole other like skill. Like
Yeah, it
it's like
really is.
learning abbreviations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of them were very good at like improvising, and like I remember this woman made, I forget if it was a blanket or like a cape or maybe it was like both for her, I think for her grandson, and
Mhm.
it was like the Puerto Rican flag,
Oh
and
wow.
like it was just so impressive to like watch her kind of be able to do the color work, and that this was like her second or third thing that she made. Like it wasn't like she was like crafting for a while and like learned how to do color work like with crochet, from another person or from the internet or something. Like she kind of just figured it out on her own. So
Yeah.
yeah, that definitely relates to like the agency that I feel like you talked about with your own experience, but um yeah, also like yeah, the agency to be able to say like I'm not going to use the pattern for that. I'm going to try and figure it out on my own.
Yeah, because like it really does teach you a lot, like you were saying earlier, about like resilience, about like fucking up and then, being like, all right, well, I learned from that, I can change it. Like I say all the time that knitting is like in some ways, more forgiving than crochet because like I always want to just like scream when it gets to the point where like I realize that I've goofed something up on something that I'm crocheting, and of course it's all sequential, so you have to pull everything out back to
Uh-huh.
that point versus like with knitting, it's easy enough to drop one, three. I mean, I've had to drop like a couple columns of
All the way
stitches.
down. Yeah.
Right, but then you can fix it and then work it back up instead of having to tear out like every single like last inch that you worked like since then.
Yeah. That's
And
interesting
so
because I didn't feel that way.
mm,
Like I think that I didn't really learn how to fix mistakes in knitting like to that extent until kind of
mm-hmm,
recently. And I would
mm,
end up pulling a lot of things out. And then the problem with knitting is that you have to put all of those stitches back on the needles, and then you have
yeah,
more of a propensity to drop them if like you have to rip the whole thing to down to a certain point or something. Whereas crochet,
yeah.
it's like yeah, you have to rip it out, but then you only have to put like one loop back on one needle. So
Right, because like you only have one live stitch at a time versus like
yeah,
all of them for knitting. Yeah.
yeah,
So there's different like challenges, but
yes,
And so it kind of depends on, but this is why I encourage people, like, if you don't like one, try the other. Like, if you don't
Yeah.
like either of those, like, try something else. Like, there are so many different types of fiber crafts, which is another thing I was thinking about. It's like, I was asking earlier about, like, how can crafters kind of get started with using astrology for this, but what about the reverse? How can
Hmm.
astrologers, like, get into crafting, like, and how, where can you start, like, if you want to learn to craft?
Yeah, that's such a good question because of like the way that we've been talking about the different aspects of your chart and like why we've got each of us has gotten into crafting based on like
Mm-hmm.
some of the parts of our chart. So I feel like if you are an astrologer and you already know about like um you already have relationships with the planets and you kind of know to some extent what they need, then you can sort of support those planets through trying different sorts of fiber crafts. Like if you like I mentioned before, like maybe you have a Venus in Libra and maybe it's like square Mars in Aries or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to like make something that looks nice, but maybe you also want to be stabbing something. Then maybe you want to make like cross stitching because you're kind of like going through like poking something or like stabbing something repeatedly in order to make something beautiful in the end.
Yeah,
I feel
needle
like that's
felting.
also yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. That's also something that I feel like with just like needles and like knitting with my Mars,
Mm.
pulling my
Oh,
chart
that's such
is
a
like
good point. Yeah.
yeah. And I also learned recently about like super what do they call them? Like the the more yeah, sharps, I guess, when you get
Mm.
sharp needles
Mm.
and they kind of make you knit faster. Like my Mars in Virgo was like, wait, what?
You're like, oh, knitting
Yeah,
faster, you say?
yeah, and with sharper needles that make me
Yeah,
knit faster.
ooh.
Like it's definitely interesting how you can. I think like people might not think that Mars has a lot to do with crafting based on like having maybe limited craft knowledge, but like
Mm-hmm.
Mars definitely plays into the way that you craft or what you like to craft with.
Yeah.
So I think that that's also a place to look as well. And then like we talked about the moon, um, and that can kind of speak to like what you need repetitively. I feel like, or what you need
Mm.
to kind of like seek a pattern in, or whether you need to be crafting repetitively, or maybe it's something that like you do, like less frequently because you have maybe like a moon, maybe I'm trying to think. Like I mean, maybe like a a moon in an Earth sign might like pick it up. Like I know a lot of people who have many projects going at once, but they're very slow with them, or like that
Sure.
might be like an Earth moon thing, whereas maybe like a fire moon might want to only have one project going on at a time, but like
Yeah.
needs to finish it quickly. Yeah.
That's me. Yeah, for sure. Like, yeah, I just want to throw myself at it until it's like done.
Yeah,
So,
and then the sense of accomplishment of finishing it kind of like comes faster. That's why I a lot of times if people ask like what's your favorite thing to make, I always say hats because like it goes
mm,
very fast and I get to the sense of accomplishment quicker, so I don't have to be like because there's a certain point in some projects like this is why I'm in awe of many people like for our committed knitters where I was knitting in the jail, we also used to have a fundraiser, and
mm-hmm.
it was knit around the clock. And they used to do it like 24 hours the first couple of times, but I think it like got to be too much. But we would go from like 6 a.m. until like 10 p.m. or something like that, and would
Wow.
just like knit all day in the bottom of the basement of this yarn store, and they'd order like breakfast and lunch and dinner and stuff.
Yeah.
um, and like there were some women that would show up with the same blanket as the year before, and they would just like be working on this blanket for like years and years and years, and it was like a super beautiful blanket. And I'm sure they had like other sock projects or something going on like
Yeah.
on in the background, but it's like I just could not, like, I would get to a certain point in a project like that where I just like I can't. Like, I just can't do something for that long. I need to be able to get to the end or like see the end in sight. So it's also interesting to think about that in the chart. Like, that seems like a kind of an earthy type of thing to be working on something for a long period of time, or Saturnian.
Mm,
Um, and like have that delayed gratification, but it's like a process, and the process is very long and drawn out, but you end up with something that's like large and beautiful in the end.
yeah. Oh yeah, I mean that's what I think of with like quilting a lot of the times. Like
Hmm.
it's just a lot of quilts are so just making something that big,
Yeah.
like, and piecing all of these little bits together and like yeah, it's just like it's so incredible to me because I don't like I used to make shawls, which are probably like the largest things that I would make like on average. I did a baby blanket last year, which was really cute, but I'm not usually a like huge project person because of that. Like it takes so long, kind of
Hmm.
for what you get. So I think it's finding that sweet spot that makes everybody, like every one of your planets, happy. Like you
Yeah.
have to, this is the living component of it. It's like you have to get everybody together for a meeting, and look at those aspects and be like, okay, what is going to work out here with everybody?
Hmm.
Like how can I make the most of you happy? Like what's a consensus we can reach as far as, or like what different types of crafts do I need to do to work with each of you?
Yeah.
Like, because I mean, that's also another thing is like, I don't know anybody who does just one single craft or art. Like, it's almost impossible. Like,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, the art school that I went to was very heavily like had a very heavy emphasis on inter being interdisciplinary.
Hmm.
And so I feel like many of the people who I went to school with like had to have multiple disciplines because that was kind of like required of us.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, I think, like the best way to do crafting and art, because you're able to um, like layer different aspects of different crafts that are supporting each other, like, and learn about the ways that they kind of connect. Like, I'm thinking about the way that you make like something round, I guess using a lathe, like in woodcraft, but
Mm-hmm.
like you kind of do something similar when you're throwing a pot on a wheel, because you have to like
Right.
repeatedly force something into a certain shape in order, or like carve away parts of something to create a certain shape. And yeah, like creating the connections between those things, I think, is what can help us understand like why we need crafts in our life too.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think everybody has a creative urge of some kind. Like everybody has a fifth house and like a Venus and a Mars and a moon and, all of this. Like everybody wants to, make something and has enjoyed making something. And a lot of times it's, and like kind of bringing this back to the childhood perfection stuff, like when you're growing up, and having your first experiences of art, both of making it yourself and of seeing it around you, it's so formative, like
Hmm.
it really is when you think about with kids, like one of the things that honestly kind of like, like there are a lot of reasons that I'm not having kids, but one of them is like that they are so sticky, like that when when you witness stuff as a kid, it really stays with you and it really like it sets that tone for the rest of your life. Like,
Hmm.
your tastes might change since then, but like you were talking about with nostalgia, like you're always gonna see that one thing or think about that one thing, and it is always gonna have this like really special meaning and like relevance for you.
Hmm.
And so it's like sometimes it's about needing to get back to that and connect to it. And so I wonder if that's something why crochet and knitting and macrame keep coming back, because it is this familiar kind of thing, and it's something that's kind of recurred throughout a lot of people's lives, and a
Hmm.
lot of time from family and that kind of thing. Yeah, I feel like I had a second part to that thought, but it's left now, so. Um, yeah. Um, was there anything else, I think, that we wanted to talk about? Mm, I guess, unless you had something else, I mean, I'd like to, talk about kind of maybe what your plans are sort of for the future, like where you see kind of yourself going with crafting, maybe in the next bit.
Yeah, sure. Um, so I'm working on these. I have like three. I'm calling them like beta astro knit garments, which I'm making that um, we like the three people who are kind of like my what's the word for that? Not customers. I'll just say like co-creators because we're like
Mm-hmm.
basically working on them together.
Right.
And I chose like a couple of different elections for them, and then we decided together which ones fit best for like what they wanted to have on their bodies and like something to wear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's a process that has been taking a long time, and also like I'm doing three at once, which I've learned is like not something that I think I should be doing in the future. So
Yeah,
I've
that
learned a lot
seems like a
from
lot.
these. Yeah. So I've learned a lot from these practice ones, and I also just started a wait list because I'm going to open up books to do more of these like in the next couple of months, but it's going to be like a one at a time thing. So I'm going to
Yeah.
basically like only send the bookings like probably like once a month or once every other month based on how long it takes me to do them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm only going to send the bookings to the wait list. So if you're interested in this process, you can get on my wait list. I'll have to put it like more in a clear place on my website, but
Mm-hmm.
I can also put the link for that, and it's also in my like bio on uh, social media.
Yeah.
Um, and then once I start doing that, my plan is that at least for the first year, I'm not going to do like larger sized garments. So it's like I'll probably have like purses or
Mm.
like pouches, altar cloths, and scarves and hats. So like all kind of like smaller things that are quicker to make, but
Yeah.
and different accessories like that don't necessarily have to be based on a size. Um, so that's my plan for those. And I also have my books open for astrology readings because, well, not just because of this, but part of the
Mm-hmm.
thing that I should also mention about the astronit garments is like because there's a co-creating aspect to it, there I do need like to work with people that have some sort of a background in astrology because I'm like asking you for your opinion on the electional chart, and it requires that you already know like something about your chart. So if you don't already know that, then you can book a reading with me. But if you are an astrologer and are interested in like receiving or commissioning one of these garments in the future, then you can sign up for my wait list. So there's different like areas of entry, but um, it the like collaboration process also kind of like lends itself to learning, and it's sort of like a multi-step process where I'm sort of like providing a reading as
Mm.
part of it, but because of the electional chart and like rooting the election to like your natal chart, so
Mm-hmm.
because of that it's like already a kind of a large process where there's multiple like meetings involved. So um, if you don't already know too much about astrology, or if you're a beginner, then you should get a chart reading with me first so that there's like kind of a base knowledge that you have that we can work together on. Um, and I also am hoping to write more about astrology and the connection with astrology and crafting.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, and I mentioned about like the history of crafting, that I'd like to kind of do more research on that and write about that.
Right.
Um, and you can check out my blog and my website because I have done some writing on the connections between the two. And then I also mentioned about my Mars in Virgo. So I've written a little bit about the upcoming Mercury retrograde in Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm hoping to write a little bit more about how that connects to crafting as well, because I'm
Okay.
interested to see, like, based on past Mars retrogrades and mercurial signs, like,
Yeah.
how that might relate to changes in crafting.
I mean, do you plan on doing any kind of like mini retrograde readings for that? Because
Oh, that's a good question.
I've been stressed for a couple of months just because like it stations retrograde on my sun, which will be, activated in my ninth house, like as part of my ninth house
Oh,
year, and then stations direct on my Mercury, like both
yeah.
of them to the degree. So I'm a little sweaty.
Yeah.
So, if you're offering any kind of mini readings like that with any kind of Mars wisdom, any of that good Earth Mars calming kind of thing, because my like fire Mars is immediately like, what's the
Yeah.
like, how do I jump into action? What do I have to like, do I need to stockpile like gunpowder and stuff? Like, I don't know, kind of
Yeah.
like
I
I
feel
need to be
like,
ready to react.
yeah, I also had I think it was my last solar return chart was
Mm-hmm.
Mercury. It was like, well, it was when Mars was in Gemini the last time and conjunct the North Node,
Mm-hmm.
which is like its signature in my natal chart. And then the my solar return chart was also like the ascendant was exactly on my Mars. And so I feel like that year I also learned like kind of maybe a bit about what is to come for the Mars
Mm.
retrograde. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought of doing like an offering about that, but I have been wanting to like do a specific offering for reading crafters charts. So it might be cool to loop those things in together.
Yeah.
um yeah.
Interesting.
Um, yeah. I feel like there was maybe something else that I thought about that you maybe brought up, but I think those are the big things that I should mention.
Yeah.
The childhood perfections also, my books are open, like I said, for June and July, so I'm hoping to do more of those too because I've really enjoyed that. Um, and like my Cancer moon in the ninth is also like, this is what I want to do. So,
That's such a teachery placement. Like,
yeah.
that's so nice though. And like, like again, I'm happy to talk about it. Like it was so helpful for me getting that reading done. Like you were talking about like, if for whatever reason like you don't remember your childhood well, like, and that's me. Like I have like kind of various events that I know took place, but I have a really hard time like placing them at all within time itself. But having
Hmm.
that, framework of profections to work with, being like, okay, so if we were looking at events of this type, these fifth, sixth, seventh house year kind of things, then that would have been about this year. So then this event probably did happen then. And, once, because like you have these things that are the origins of things that you're dealing with now,
Hmm.
but if you can't even place where they came from, how can you kind of expect to sort of get all of the rest of that in order?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I
so,
think that that's also something that's helpful about it is like connecting what's happening now. Like if you
mm,
don't remember very well what happened in the past, well, you can think back to your most recent perfection year, and maybe that can give us some clues to start to think about like what happened during that perfection year as a child too.
right.
So, because like that's the main, I feel like that's my main takeaway a lot of the times from perfection years is it's like your life is a cycle, and each time that you go around the chart, you learn something new. So, when you were a child, it's like, this is the first time that I'm dealing with this topic. and you probably like maybe you didn't deal with it super well because it's the first time that you had to deal with like this aspect in your chart that's like maybe difficult to work with or something like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
it can give you some clues about like it's like we were talking about knitting too, like the mistakes that you made, then that way you know not to make that mistake in the next like thing that you make. So um that's I feel like it's a helpful way to think about like the perfection years because it's the beginning of a cycle
Mm.
and the first like learning of what that cycle means for you.
Yeah. 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 So like I really recommend folks like it was yeah, it was a really, really helpful experience. And like, I was saying I mentioned this on Twitter when I talked about it, but yeah, like your moon in Cancer, like your teachery ness, really comes through and like it's really comforting. Like and I think that that's one of the things that I value so much about what you do is like with the crafting and with the teaching, like you just it's this very calming, guiding sort of presence that you have, and I think spirit that goes through your work. And yeah, it does just feel very blankety, kind of, granny squares and warm and cozy. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if that's the kind of experience that people want, like, this is who I'm going to recommend. So, like, if anybody's out there that's looking for somebody to get a reading from, and, if you like what Kelly's got going, go to their website and check it out and book with them. But I really recommend it. And I'll also say while I'm talking about your stuff, I recommend that people go and check out the blog that you wrote on Juno and Venus and abortion access. I thought that was really good as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with the asteroid goddesses and like
yeah.
craft kind of expanding more on like those types of topics that like we talked about Venus and the moon, and I feel like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times like that's what we attribute where we attribute those like feminine or like I mean crafting like because it's been historically like relegated as a like women's work kind of thing or like
Yeah.
that's the thing that I also like when you think about like reproductive care also like
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like reproducing like children but it's also like reproducing like and producing like all of the things that you need to care for someone which can include like crafts that you make and that's like part of Juno's domain is like reproducing care for others so
Mm.
definitely the asteroid goddesses. Check them out and learn more about their stories because they give more dimension to these like types of topics that are sometimes not considered as important, especially when like we only have like two um, like feminine characterized planets that
Yeah.
in tradition, but yeah, and then I also I'm hoping to do like soon in the next like month or so a like meetup group for to talk about like astrology and crafting. So
Ooh.
um if you follow me on social media then you'll kind of see about when that's going to happen cuz I feel like I've met a lot of people over the internet who are interested in these two things and I feel
Yeah.
like it's something that I would love to talk more about. So
Yeah, because like I remember like there was at least one thread recently where like you and I and like a bunch of other people ended up kind of being like, oh, you craft and like, this kind of thing. Because it's like, yeah, like Mercury as the planet of astrology and being so like associated with crafting,
yeah.
it's not that out there, I guess. And yeah, it'd be really great to like see because like I think a lot of astrologers who craft maybe haven't seen the ways to cross them over yet, or are like, well, I want to, but I don't know how exactly. Like I really felt what you were saying earlier about like with the gridding because that's what filet crochet has been for me. It's the same
Mm,
thing, it's gridding out patterns, and so I was
yeah.
like, okay, well, it would work really well for this is just glyphs, like
Yep.
very easy to reproduce. And so that's been a really good entryway into that. I was also going to say about like um, you know, like choosing like colors and stuff. I think like going with like planetary
Yes.
colors is really
Yeah,
fun and like really inspiring.
I just last night did like a Instagram stories on yarn, like on
Yeah.
planetary colors.
Did you
Because I feel
really?
like it's yeah, and it was like a you do the like this or that, like the poll questions.
Yeah.
And it was so fun for me to do it because it's like I feel like it's almost kind of also like a little trickster thing because it's like, well, green is technically like the planetary color for Venus, but like there's this pink that's called like rose or something, and does that fit better? And then like seeing um, what people think fits which planet better, or like different shades
Mm,
of blue, or like different colorways that maybe this one has like more other colors combined with blue, but this one's like a pure bright blue, and which planet does that fit? So
right.
I'm gonna do more of those because it was interesting to like learn what people think in general, because it's something that I've had like one-on-one conversations with the people that I'm making these custom garments for. Like, do
Mm-hmm.
you feel like your like Saturn Venus conjunction in Pisces is more of like this kind of color or this kind of color? And there's a
That's a
lot of
really good point.
nuances to it. Yeah. Because there's a lot of nuances to how you view something based on your chart and where you're
Yeah.
like maybe like Jupiter is generally like a royal blue, but like my Jupiter in Aquarius is like a light aquamarine or something. So,
Mm-hmm. Right.
um yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, just speaking of the colors, because I always have my reference copy of Hellenistic astrology on my desk. Let me
Yes.
go through and just see real quickly, because I know that, who is it? He lists like Valence's significations of the
Mhm.
planets, I think. And I know talks about the colors associated with them, which I think are sometimes surprising or like ones that people forget about.
Yeah.
So I always forget how long Saturn is too. He gets blamed with everything. Okay, so the sun, the color is lemon yellow, which sure. The moon, is light green in color, which I think is really
Oh,
interesting to think about. Yeah,
yeah.
and I always like that he specifies that the moon is also salty in taste.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, because
Um,
also I know like the moon has to do with silver too, and
yeah,
the sun has to do with gold. So that's
right.
another kind of color aspect, I guess, too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like I have so many different shades of yellow and like gold for various like solar and Jupiterian purposes. I mean, my whole overlay here, like I have tons of like blue and gold because like they're
Hmm.
so like yeah, they're so I think especially with my and like you were talking about with the placements modifying this, I have a Jupiter Saturn opposition. And
Hmm.
so I think that Jupiter in Cancer, Saturn in Capricorn, there's this element of, I think Saturn kind of brings out a bit more of that royal element of Jupiter as far as that kind of flavor goes, but Jupiter makes sure that it doesn't tend towards too serious, I
Yeah,
suppose, you know.
yeah.
Saturn is dark brown in color. Uh, Jupiter is gray and mostly white, which is not what I would have assumed first off. Mars is red. Venus is white. So Venus and Jupiter, I guess, linked through like gray and kind of white there.
Hmm.
And then Mercury also has a lot attributed. Interesting. No color.
Yeah,
Unless.
Mercury is a tough one. I feel
Yeah.
like one time I organized my closet by like planetary days,
Mm
and
hmm.
I just put all my patterned shirts in the on Wednesday on the Mercury's day.
Yeah, I mean that's why I'm making these like little bright rainbow, mercurial little pieces.
Uh
Yeah,
huh.
I love like Mercury as Yeah, multicolor. Mercury's favorite color is print.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which, yeah, I guess while I'm talking a little bit about Mercury stuff and these little guys, I've mentioned it a little bit on Twitter, but I'll give everybody here a little sneak peek. So I am going to be giving away two of these little doilies with some candles from Astatula Candle Company, who I talk about a lot on Twitter. People may have seen, but to celebrate Mercury going back into Gemini, which I believe happens tomorrow, right? Like around noon, I think,
I think
Eastern.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's either tomorrow or the next day.
I'm really excited for it because then it'll finally like officially be my Mercury return because I think it's stationed at like what was it, three, was it three Gemini, something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, and my
Mm-hmm.
Mercury's at eight Gemini, so it was that like so close, but
Yeah.
we're coming back for the second hit. But so I've got a Gemini candle here. So there'll be two winners. So one person will get one of these doilies, and then this Gemini candle, which is scented with mint, lemongrass, and lavender. It smells really, really great. And then the other one that I've got is, what do I have? The spare. I also have a Mercury planetary candle that I'll be giving away as well. Well, I'll show you the one that I actually have currently burning on my desk. So she makes these beautiful planetary intention candles as well, which are dressed with appropriate herbs and minerals and stuff. So, yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, that's going to be the best place to find out when I post that. It'll be running for just a couple days to celebrate my solar return, which will be later this week. So, exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been going almost about 2.5 hours. How are you feeling?
I'm I feel like it was a beautiful conversation. I'm very blessed to have it, but I should probably start getting moving.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, this was really good. I'm really really glad that we were able to sit down and talk about all of this. Again, it's something I've really been wanting to talk about for like quite a while. Um, and this definitely isn't the last conversation that we're gonna have about it. So, let me see here. So, I guess just to handle, is there any other little stream business that I want to handle? I'll be back on Tuesday with Zombie Paper talking about flags because I think it's Flag Day on the 14th. So we're just gonna talk about flags and kind of see where that takes us, I guess. um, and yeah, U.S. Flag Day. Yeah, okay. So yeah, all right, great. Well, everybody check out Kelly's site at Moonknitter. I posted all of their social links in chat. I'm gonna go ahead and get this raid going so we can go visit Itarama. But thank you like again so much, Kelly. It was really really great having you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, take care. I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. And I will talk to you later. Bye for now.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.